On Sunday, Italians went to the polls to elect their first government under their new electoral system. And with the results in, it looks like the largest party is Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy, a reformed right-wing outfit that's become the de facto opposition since refusing to join Mario Draghi's coalition last year. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at those results, Meloni's politics, and whether the party will suffer the same fate as basically every other populist Italian party. A brief honeymoon, followed by an inevitable electoral defeat. Before we get into the results, let's quickly start by explaining Italy's electoral system. Italy's electoral system was most recently amended in 2017, and as such, this is the first election since. Under the new system, the number of legislatures in the two chambers has been reduced. The lower house, otherwise known as the chamber, previously had 630 deputies, but now has 400, while the upper house, known as the Senate, will go from 315 senators to 200. Both houses are elected via the same system though, excluding a handful of seats which are elected by Italians living abroad. 3/8 of seats are elected by a first-past-the-post system in single-member districts, essentially the same system we have here in the UK, while the remaining 5/8 are elected by proportional representation in larger regional multi-member districts. Now, voters only get one vote for each chamber, or 2 votes overall, which means that when you vote for your local candidates, you're also voting for that party at the regional level. The main thing you need to know for this video, though, is that for those first-past-the-post seats, parties can form coalitions if they want to improve their chances. Anyway, this particular election was triggered by the recent collapse of Mario Draghi's government. Now, we did a full video on that at the time, so you can go and watch that if you want to know more detail. But the basic idea is that no party achieved a majority in the last elections in 2018. So when COVID hit and the government needed to get its stuff together, they formed a unity government under former ECB governor Mario Draghi. Importantly, the largest party outside of Draghi's unity coalition was the right-wing Fratelli d'Italia, known in English as either the Brothers of Italy or FDL, who became the de facto opposition party. Now, the FDL had only won 4% of the vote in 2018, but they benefited enormously from this arrangement. That's because they got to portray themselves as the main anti-establishment party, and successfully bled votes from other right-wing parties like Lega Nord and Forza Italia, who had to moderate their populist politics while in coalition with Draghi. Now, Draghi's coalition ultimately collapsed after the Five Star Movement, a major player within the coalition, split into 2 parties and withdrew its support for the coalition, in large part because they thought Draghi was being too aggressive in their stance against Russia in Ukraine. Now, Draghi decided that he couldn't form another government without Five Star, and as such, he resigned in July, triggering this round of elections. By this point, having capitalized on increased publicity and their opposition status, FDL were now polling at above 20%, well above any other right-wing party, and neck and neck with the centre-left Democratic Party. And in the subsequent months, that polling gap remained relatively stable. As we got closer to the election, the gap between FDL and DP did widen a little, and Five Star did see a late resurgence. But importantly, the 3 right-wing parties, FDL, Lega and Forza Italia, agreed to form an electoral coalition, while the left-wing parties failed to enter a similar agreement. That's because the leader of the Democratic Party refused to sign up to any coalition with Five Star because of their role in bringing down the previous Draghi government. And while they did attempt a coalition agreement with a smaller centrist party, Azione, that only lasted a week. Now, Azione went on to form a smaller centrist coalition with another smaller party called Italia Viva, led by former Prime Minister Matteo Renzi, while the Democratic Party ended up joining forces with the Italian Green Party and a couple of other smaller left-leaning parties. With all the agreements and coalitions shaken out, things looked good for the FDL in the last round of polling, which emerged 2 weeks before the election. FDL were polling at about 25%, 5 percentage points ahead of the Democratic Party, while Five Star had edged ahead of the Northern League, sitting at about 13%. Let's get forward to the election day itself, though. And as of Monday morning, with the vast majority of single-member first-past-the-post districts counted, it looks like the polls were broadly correct. With turnout at a historic low of 64%, the FDL won 26% of the popular vote, while the Democratic Party won 19% and Five Star won 15.5%. Together then, the right-wing coalition won about 44% of the popular vote, while the left-wing bloc won just 26%. As you'd expect then, the right-wing coalition won a vast majority of the first-past-the-post seats, and are now on track to win the majority in both houses. This means that FDL will hold by far and away the most seats in Parliament, and Meloni will become Italy's first ever female Prime Minister. So, given that the country is in for a big change, what actually are the FDL's policies? Well, while many FDL politicians have said some pretty unpalatable things in the past, and Meloni herself was once part of the youth wing of Italy's neo-fascist movement, their policy platform is ultimately more bark than bite. And it's actually remarkably similar to that of the Conservatives in the UK. When it comes to economic policy, Meloni is in many ways a classic fiscal conservative. She doesn't like deficits, she wants to cut welfare, and also wants to reduce the tax burden for Italian businesses. That said, she broadly wants to continue with the structural reforms implemented by Draghi that the EU are requiring Italy to conduct if they want to receive $200 billion worth of EU COVID recovery bonds. However, she is more nationalistic than other fiscal conservatives. She doesn't like globalization, wants to spend more money supporting domestic businesses, and has even suggested banning foreign companies from buying Italian ones. She also has an interesting natalist slant, and because of that, she wants to encourage Italians to have more children by drastically increasing support for families. When it comes to social policies then, Meloni and the FDL hit all of the usual talking points. She often rallies against the so-called LGBT lobby and the ideology of gender. But her policy platform is remarkably unsubstantial in this area. The FDL have promised to keep same-sex civil unions and Italy's existing abortion law. Similarly, while Meloni and the FDL are clearly Eurosceptic, they don't want to leave either the EU or the Euro. Unlike some of their other right-wing counterparts, most notably Salvini, Meloni and the FDL are also remarkably hawkish on Ukraine, and have come out in favour of further arms shipments to the country. The only really controversial policy here is regarding immigration, with the FDL proposing a naval blockade of parts of the North African coast. But it's unclear, A, how that could actually be imposed, and B, whether it be any more successful than the existing cordon maintained by Frontex, the EU's border control agency. So that's what they're actually planning to do, which is a little jarring from their much grander rhetoric. So, with that in mind, what does the future actually hold for the FDL? Well, it's obviously too early to tell, but history suggests that it's easier to promise reform than actually achieve it in Italy. Many politicians have tried, but none have succeeded. No party or alliance has succeeded in getting re-elected since the collapse of the post-war political system in the early 1990s, and the average Italian government lasts just 20 months. We're not saying that there's no hope for the FDL here, just that their rise follows a normal pattern in Italian politics, which usually doesn't end well. Regardless, if you're not a fan of this kind of right-wing politics, this election could be another bleak result among a sea of other far-right victories.